Good, good evening and welcome to the third Ulster County virtual mini conference of 2020. These virtual mini conferences have taken the place of our usual Ulster County History Conference scheduled for April of each year, which was canceled this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The annual Ulster County History Conference has been a forum for bringing together the local historical community to explore a variety of issues from local historians and interpreters of local history, from access to information and resources to demonstrations highlighting new ways for reaching out to the community. Thanks to going virtual, we have been able to open our conferences to members of the broader community as well. The idea for organizing this year's conference series around expanding the narrative of Ulster County history first came to me while driving around the South in the summer months before Charlottesville in 2017. On that trip, I became acutely aware of the tensions surrounding Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag, and began to muse about how we could turn the growing unrest on both sides of the divide into a teachable moment to form a new sense of community to bind the American people. Well, we all know what the years since Charlottesville have wrought in our country, but I am an inveterate dreamer. The purpose of tonight's conference is a continuation of a conversation that began last August with a discussion of the African American experience. And the purpose of that was, what can we as local and regional historians and interpreters of local history do to bring the best of our tradecraft to a fair and honest exploration and reevaluation of our local regional history to set the record straight. My thanks go out to the Ulster County History Steering Committee, an incredibly hardworking and dedicated group of local historians, genealogists, directors of local historical sites, and volunteers for organizing this and all of our previous Ulster County history conferences. The committee includes Suzanne Hausberg, Richard Hepner, Marnie Jansen, Joan Kelly, Audrey Klinkenberg, Gail Manny, Susan Sprackman, Susan Stessen-Cohen, and Rob Sweeney. My thanks go out as well to Karen Levine for so capably taking over the Zoom controls for these meetings, and to Susan Sprackman for volunteering to facilitate the question and answer sessions that follow the presentations tonight. My thanks also go out to Ulster County Executive Pat Ryan for his support for expanding the historical narrative of our remarkable diverse community. And of course, my deepest thanks go out to our presenters this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, and I'm going to turn the program over now to Susan Sprackman, who will talk to you briefly about how you can ask a question.
You need to turn on your microphone.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? Okay. To ask a question, you go to the bottom of your navigation bar, the chat button, and type in a question. The questions will be routed to Karen, who will then route them to me, and I will sort them out. If you're not signed in by name, if you have just your phone number, please put your name in the question and hold your question to 1 or 2 sentences. What we'll try to do is to group the questions so that we can ask a bunch of them together if they're on the same topic. And if yours is the only question on a specific topic, I'll ask you to ask the question to the panelists directly. Please, again, keep your questions to just 1 or 2 sentences. And in the interest of time, we'll ask our speakers to also answer shortly. We're going to do this section, the questions, in two parts. After Heather talks at the Bruegl, we'll have about 10 minutes of question and answers for her. And then after Rob and Sally talk, we'll have a question and answer period as well. So send in your questions when you have them. And at the end of each speaker's talk, we will go to those questions. Put in the name of the speaker that you want to address also. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So we're ready for our first speaker. Tonight we're going to hear from Heather Bruegl first, and she opened her description of what she intends to talk about with, I think, the perfect sentence, which is oftentimes history is written by the victors, those in power, and you miss a great portion of history. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the Native history that is so often overlooked. Heather is a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge Munsee. She was inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where her passion for Native American history was born. She has spoken for numerous groups, including at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh for Indigenous Peoples Day in 2017, the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C., and the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota, for their Talking Circle series. She's also become an accidental activist and speaks to different groups about intergenerational racism and trauma, and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in the Native community. While Heather calls Michigan home, she has recently moved to Wisconsin and is now the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge Munsee Community. In addition to that, she currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. So Heather, if you're ready, I'm turning it over to you now. Thank you.
I am ready. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to be part of this, and just really happy to bring a little bit of Indigenous history to tonight's conference. And so I'm very excited to be talking to you a little bit about who the Stockbridge Munsee community is, who we are, what our history is in our homelands, and how we ended up here in Wisconsin and who we are today. So I'm going to give you a brief history of that, but just a little bit about why history is written by the victors, because how often do you really hear about Indigenous history when you're learning history? You don't really hear about it in school, little bits, or else it's glossed over. And when you do hear history, you are hearing almost a sugar-coated version of it. We just finished up Native American Heritage Month, which was in the month of November. And so while I usually travel a lot during that month due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I traveled a lot virtually. So talking about Native history, because it's not something you often hear about. It's not something that is talked about, broadly or openly. And, within Native American Heritage Month, there's a little holiday called Thanksgiving. And the history for Thanksgiving is often shielded in myth and not really discussed, and if I told you that many Native nations in the East, including the ones who greeted the Pilgrims, the Wampanoags, celebrate a day of mourning, how many of you would probably have known that? Not a lot. And so, Thanksgiving in the Native community is met differently than it is met in the community as a whole. And so tonight, while you are in your homes, whether you're on ancestral homeland of the Stockbridge Munsee or not, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the people who lived in that area, because I feel like that's super important. That's where our story starts, and that's who we are, and that is a history that's often overlooked. And thanks to James Fenimore Cooper and his book, The Last of the Mohicans, a lot of history that is learned about the Mohican people, which are part of the Stockbridge Munsee, is not accurate. And so that's why I titled this Not the Last of the Mohicans, because I'm sitting right here in front of you. And in fact, I'm coming to you from my office, which is situated on the Stockbridge Munsee Reservation here in Northeast Wisconsin, that was formed through the Treaty of 1856. And I'm going to tell you how we got here, what we're doing today, and how our community has grown. And so I think this covers definitely a history of where we were when we were in the New York area and in Ulster County. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. Who are the Stockbridge Munsee? Well, we are the Mohican people. We are the people of the waters that are never still. We settled along the Mohican-Munsee, the river that flows both ways. You know the Mohican-Munsee as the Hudson. Its traditional name to us is the Mohican-Munsee, and we had villages along that area, and gathered and hunted and practiced agriculture and told stories and spoke our language along that area. And so water is extremely important. Water is life. Water is the beginnings of everything. And even through our reservation here in Wisconsin, we have a beautiful river that flows right through it. And so that's really important to talk about. And so I wanted to make sure that, words and names matter. And so a lot of the times, I would say probably about 90% of the time, when I refer to the Hudson, I refer to it as the Mohican-Munsee, because I feel like that's super important. It had a name before the name was colonized. And so I just wanted to make a note of that. So where did we live? We didn't live just along the Mohican-Munsee. We had a vast territory that encompassed Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. We even had small settlements along our Trail of Tears in Indiana, and even some in Kansas, right outside Fort Leavenworth. So we covered a vast amount of territory, from southwest Vermont, the entire Mohican-Munsee River Valley, from New York to from Lake Champlain to Manhattan, western Massachusetts up to Connecticut, up to the Connecticut River Valley, northwest Connecticut, and portions of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And when I talk about portions of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, even parts of Connecticut, I'm talking about the Munsee or Lenape side of who the Stockbridge Munsee are. And I'm going to tell you how we came together in just a little bit. But I just want to make sure that you're aware of our territory is vast. And so, we covered a lot of territory. I am enrolled citizen in Oneida and first line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. So all of my ancestors came from out east. And so whether they were in the Oneida and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, I really, in my head, I claim all of New York as my home. But so I just want to make let you know how big our territory was and how much it means to us. And so because of our location, we were really the first to encounter explorers and have to deal with colonization. In September of 1609, Henry Hudson sailed up the Mohican-Munsee into the land of the Mohican, and we saw him and we were like, hey, what's up? What are you doing here? What's going on? And because, we hadn't ever seen anyone like Henry Hudson before. We were wanting to know what was happening. So in 1614, a Dutch trading post was set up on Castle Island, and the main source of trading there was the fur trade. Whatever animals were around, mainly beaver, and the furs were really plentiful and they were worth a lot of money. So it was it was hardcore. The fur trade was hit hardcore there. But eventually furs got difficult to find. And that happens when you are, you're going after a commodity, and what happens, it runs out, it starts to run out. And so the fur trade was, kind of dwindling. Tensions were built up between the Mohicans and other nations in the area, including the Mohawks. The English would eventually replace the Dutch in the area, and forced movement was seen as almost inevitable. It was going to happen. It was just a matter of when it was going to happen. So the forced movement started in the early 1700s. We moved further east near the Housatonic River. We settled with other nations that were in the area, and that would have been in what is present-day Massachusetts and Connecticut. Our economic way of life became dependent on the trade with the Europeans coming in and what was happening. So our traditional items of, that we had were no longer being made. And we were given new items such as iron kettles, cloth, guns, and colorful glass beads. And so from, those glass beads came some amazing beadwork that you can actually, once the pandemic is past, the New York State Museum actually has a lot of our beadwork in their facility that we're actually hoping to bring to Wisconsin to have on loan here for a little while so our community here can see it. But things were going on. And like I said, the English replace the Dutch and disease arrives. And so we're dealing with a lot of different things. We're dealing with the loss, the beginnings of the loss of our culture, the beginnings of the loss of our traditions, the beginnings of the loss of our language, our religion, and now we're dealing with disease. And, kind of is similar to what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with the pandemic. We know it hits communities of color disproportionately harder than outside communities. And we know in the Indigenous community in the United States right now, the pandemic is hitting harder. So it's not the first time we've had to deal with something like this. We dealt with it before. We dealt with it with the inception of settlers coming in. Boundaries were put up. Fences were put up. While we understood where each territory was, so where our territory stopped and let's say maybe the Mohawk territory began, the idea of fixed boundaries and fences was really foreign to us. It wasn't something that we had. And an example of a really strict boundary, strict fence was an area that today as Wall Street. Wall Street got its name because it was an actual wall that was put up. It was part of a fortress that went around the area, and it was to keep the Lenape out. The Dutch erected it and decided, you can't come in any farther. So these boundaries and fences that were put up really were forcing us out of our homelands. So we, had missionaries who came into the area. They entered Native villages to help convert Native people. Native people agreed to be Christianized after seeing the prosperity of the settlers. So we thought if we, converted to Christianity, that we would be doing as well as the settlers were doing, but that was not the case. In 1734, a man by the name of John Sargent came to the Mohicans in what is our Mohican village of Wahatukuk, and he preached and baptized the Mohicans. And actually, a lot of catechism that was written in English was converted to the Mohican language, so it would be easier for us to learn it. In 1738, the Mohicans gave permission to John to start a mission. And so more Europeans came into the area, and they renamed it Stockbridge after a village in England. Others who wished to hear what the mission was teaching, who wanted to hear about the Christian religion, came, and that included the Wappingers, the Brothertons, the Tuxas, the Pequot, the Mohawk, the Narragansetts, and the Oneidas. And they all kind of merged together with the Mohicans. And from there, in that Mohican village that was now named Stockbridge, all of the Indians who gathered there now went under the name of Stockbridge. They were known as the Stockbridge Indians. There were several wars that would have been part of our history and part of the history of, New York, Massachusetts, and all of that other area. The French and Indian Wars were conflicts between France and England over the territory that they took from Native people. The American Revolution and the War of 1812 were about creating an independent nation on the land that was stolen from the Native Americans. So it was, one war was about whose land is this that we just took. The next war was about wanting to have independence on that land that was taken. The Stockbridge Mohicans, the Oneidas, and the Tuscaroras, as well as other Native nations, fought alongside the colonists, but it's not a history you hear about. Nobody talks about the fact that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy broke up over the American Revolution and who was siding with who. The Battle of Van Cortlandt was a battle that was fought just outside of Brooklyn, where a number of Stockbridge Mohicans, gave their life for independence, but you don't hear about it. And that is because history is written by the victors. You don't hear about the Native people. You don't hear about, Crispus Attucks, who's the first to die at the Boston Massacre, being of African and Indigenous descent. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about how, we fought in that war to help win independence. It's just something that's breezed over. And what else nobody talks about is after war, after that revolution, a lot of Stockbridges returned home and found that their lands had been lost and that they were being forced from the area. So we moved several times, several times. So after we left Stockbridge, we went to New Stockbridge, which was near Oneida Lake. While we were there, we flourished. However, things were going to change again and we were going to move. We had a brief stint in White River, Indiana, among the Miami and the Delaware, who were also known as the Lenape. Delaware is the colonized name given to them. When we arrived there after a year of travel, so it took a year to get to White River, Indiana, we found that the Lenape had been coerced into selling their land. So we moved again. Back in New York, people from the War Department were negotiating with the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin. And in the Treaty of 1822, a treaty was reached and the Stockbridge moved to Kaukauna near the Fox River, which is just south of where I am now. And from there, many more who were in New York came out. We were the English-speaking. Electa Quinney was the first public school teacher in the area. We had the first Protestant minister in the area, and we had the first Christian temperance union in the area. But even though all of that was good, we were forced to move again after the Fox River was deemed as a major waterway. So we moved to the east side of Lake Winnebago in 1834. And it was there that a group of Lenape who were still living in the New York area out east joined us. And from that moment on, we were known as the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. Finally, the Treaty of 1856, we moved to where we are currently in the townships of Bartlemy and Red Springs in Shawano County. We're in northeast Wisconsin. We're about an hour west of Green Bay. Forestry became the base of the economy, but because the forests were so good here, that brought in outsiders. And so they clear cut the land and we lost a lot of land due to that. It wasn't until, so this is, the photo on here is actually a photo of the river that's on our reservation. It's gorgeous, it's absolutely beautiful. And so, yeah, we're here in Shawano County. Forestry became the base, but in order to survive, we had to sell off some of our land in 1871. Under the Indian Reorganization Act, what that did is it allowed us to regain 15,000 acres in the township of Bartlemy. 2,500 were immediately placed in trust. In 1972, the remaining 13,000 were placed in trust. And then also with the BIA or the IRA, we formed our new constitution that was on the model that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had. And we finally had a land base for people to build homes on. And that was really important. And so who are we today? We're the largest employer in the county that we live in. Our land base is just under 25,000 acres, and we have an enrollment of just over 1,500. Our Cultural Affairs Department, which is the department that I oversee, houses our Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum, which is home to the largest Mohican archives in the world. I oversee all of that. We have our historic preservation offices, which are located out east, and they're charged with preserving and protecting culturally significant sites to the Stockbridge Munsee community, those in New York, including Ulster County. And then we also have our language revitalization program, which is tasked with revitalizing our Mohican language and keeping our Munsee language alive and well so that people are able to speak it. And so I feel like telling the story of the Stockbridge Munsee, just a brief history of it, was super important because, as stated in the description for this, history is written by the victors. And I can guarantee that many times Native history is not talked about at all. And as a historian, I consider myself a historian first and foremost by my training. That's something that we have to encompass, that we have to be part of. And there would be no United States history without Indigenous history. We were there at every single step of the way. And it's super easy to incorporate Native history into talking about US history. And so I really just want to thank you for allowing me to give you this brief history of who the Stockbridge Munsee are, who are the people that settled and lived around in Ulster County, and who were part of the story of the East and the story of New York. There's a book that's called Native New Yorkers, and it's about the Indigenous history in the state of New York. And I believe that title to be very true. A lot of people, you grow up in Brooklyn, Manhattan, whatever, you're like, oh, I'm native to New York, but we really are native to New York. And so I just, again, thank you very much. And I'm, looking forward to answering any questions you might have about Stockbridge Munsee or history or Indigenous history in general. And just as a side note, the photos on this particular slide were taken pre-pandemic. They were taken last year. So we have not had any gatherings. We've been very safe during this time. But looking at these photos right now, it makes me sad because I want to have my community back in my building. So again, I thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks a lot. That was great. Susan?
Okay. Okay, there I am. Okay, we have one question for you, Heather, from Peter Feynman. I'll ask it in the interest of time. He's attended a couple of conferences in Stockbridge and heard there was going to be an archaeological excavation there. Do you have an update?
Yes, I do. So last summer, through a grant, we were able to survey a site that would have been the home to an ox roast that was thrown for us by George Washington in 1787, I think it was, thanking us for our service in the American Revolution and fighting on the side of the colonists. And so and then right after that roast, right after that thank you, we were forced off our lands. So but last summer, through a small grant, we were able to survey the site that we think where it was, and we were actually able to find some small artifacts that show we might have been in the right area. Well, we then applied for another grant, and we were awarded that grant at the beginning of this year. And we will be able to go in further to that site and survey it even more and find out, to hopefully find some more history. So we're really excited about that.
Okay, that was the only question that came in for you, Heather. Let me see. Well, there's something from Sarah Litvin. Let me see. Wanted to know more about the languages and how you're keeping them alive.
Yeah, so we are really unique in the fact that we have 2 official languages recognized by our nation. We have the Mohican language and we have the Munsee language. And the Munsee language is there's 2 dialects spoken of the Lenape, and we happen to speak the Munsee language. So back in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a push to revitalize the Munsee language here in the Stockbridge Munsee community. And so we had community members travel out east and into Canada, into Moraviantown, to learn the language from fluent speakers that were there and bring that language back. And so we were able to have it not necessarily flourish, but have it taught in the community. A couple of years ago, we wrote a grant. There was a grant that was written that was successful, and we were awarded it. And that was to help revitalize the Mohican language, which was all but dead until this. There were no fluent speakers of the Mohican language. The last fluent speaker died in the 1930s. We only really had documentation, written documentation, and people's memories to go off of. This is how we figured out how to do it. So the grant was written, we were awarded that grant, and from that, it allowed us to contract with an extremely wonderful linguist out of Toronto, Canada, who took the documentation that we had, met with community members, asked questions, and kind of was able to bring the Mohican language back to life. So it's not the Mohican language that was spoken pre-contact. But it's as close as we can possibly get it using documentation and archives and memories. And Mohican is part of the Algonquin language family. So kind of using that as a base as well to try to build up what we now call the Stockbridge Mohican language. And so each week we offer our language classes. We have Munsee on Mondays and we have Mohican on Wednesdays. And those are, and because they're virtual, we have a much wider community that we can reach. And so anyone is welcome to join those classes. And so we have those classes. We are working on curriculum to bring our language into our Head Start program here so that the little kiddos that are there are learning the language as part of their everyday life. And hopefully in the near future, we can start an immersion program where it's just Mohican and or Munsee 24/7. And we're hopefully building up conversational and fluent speakers that can go out into the community and speak the language.
Okay, Heather, I know you have to leave and your time is tight. So let me just ask you this one question, and others we'll try to get to later. Do you have a favorite book on the history of Native Americans in New York that people can look at?
So not specifically for New York, but I have a favorite recommendation in general for an Indigenous history, and it's the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I believe she's a professor emeritus out of Oklahoma. I know at one point she was a professor out of Oklahoma, and I think she has reached emeritus status now. But she is an amazing writer of Indigenous history. And if you are familiar at all with Howard Zinn's People's History, I compare the two, not because they're exactly the same, but the concept is the same. Whereas Roxanne's book is through Indigenous eyes. So it's a very unsugar-coated history of Indigenous history in the United States, and she delves into some issues that I would have never even correlated pre-reading the book. But it's an amazing book, and I highly recommend it. And if you can get it, please do so. Support your local library or your local bookstore, and do it that way. But that's my favorite book to recommend to people.
Okay, thank you, Heather. There are a lot more questions which we'll hold till the end, and hopefully Rob and Sally will be able to answer them. Heather unfortunately had to leave early today. but we really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And if there's any questions that can't get answered, please feel to send them to my email, and I will write you up some answers and send them back.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, back to you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Heather. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And Heather's discussion about language sort of reminded me of an experience that we had that was very interesting. My wife and I in 2019 were driving around the maritime provinces more for the music than for anything else, because I just loved the French Canadian fiddle music. But we happened in Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island. We wandered into a festival of the arts, and we attended several of the sessions, and I was really taken by the fact that every session began with a moment to remember the indigenous people that whose land we were sitting on. And a lot of the historical markers were in English and French, of course, but they also were in the local native language. So that, that was a kind of inspiration to me too, in terms of reconciliation, which came up for me, I think, when I was organizing the Kingston Multicultural Festival. I forget exactly how I first found out about it, but someone showed me a copy of this reconciliation statement between the Native American community and the Old Dutch Church. And I was very impressed by it, because, I mean, what good is this work if you can't count on people coming together as equals and being able to have reasonable discussions and figure out, okay, all this happened, now where do we go with this? And so we did read a copy of the side from the Old Dutch Church. I didn't realize that there was a separate one from Anna's position, the Association for Native Americans. But then I attended a session at the Old Dutch Church and found out that there were these two, and it was a wonderful experience for me. So I'm very pleased that two of the people who were involved in that, and I can see one of the other people also on the screen, Nick Miles. Welcome, Nick. And so Rob Sweeney and Sally Avery Bermanzon are here to talk to us a little bit about what that process was like. And Rob is a local historian. He's the historian for the town of Ulster. And he's also an elder and commissioned pastor at the Old Dutch Church. He's a lifelong resident of Ulster County, Bard College graduate, and enjoys the study of all things Hudson Valley, architecture, agriculture, and landscape. He lives in a restored 18th century stone house, and I imagine that's the fireplace in back of you, Rob, and where you also raise Nankin bantams and traditional Southdown sheep. So welcome, Rob. And Sally, you wrote that you went to college in North Carolina in the 1960s, actively participating in movements for civil rights and women's equality. She was present at the Greenboro massacre in 1979, when the Ku Klux Klan attacked demonstrators and killed 5 people. Her husband survived a bullet wound to the head and remains partially paralyzed. You moved to New York, and Sally earned a PhD from City University and taught at Brooklyn College for 20 years. She wrote Through the Survivor's Eyes from the 60s to the Greenboro Massacre, which is available Vanderbilt University Press. And for a decade, you've lived in Rosendale with your husband. You're part of the Association for Native Americans of the Hudson Valley, as well as the NETOP KETOP, My Friends, Your Friends, a group dedicated to Native American practice and teaching. She recently published 2 works of historical fiction, Indian Annie, A Grandmother's Story, and Willow's Secret epigraph. So I welcome the 2 of you, and I look forward to hearing about what that was like, what that process was like. Thank you. So welcome.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I wanted to say hello to Nick Miles out there. Also, my husband's out there. And I believe that a man named Paul Tobin is also in the audience. And he's the one who made a pipe and offered it to the Old Dutch Church that got this reconciliation process started. So I'm thrilled to be here with everybody. And I also really appreciated the previous speaker's talk. It was really informative, really very good. So I'm going to talk just a very brief description of the Association of Native Americans of the Hudson Valley, or ANA, which is a group that started in the 1970s during a nationwide movement of Indigenous people celebrating their heritage. And I think that, well, it still has ramifications all over this country. And also that was happening here in Hudson Valley, where ANA began in the New Paltz area. ANA was and still is a gathering of many different people from many different tribal backgrounds. And it's an organization where everyone is welcome. For almost 40 years, ANA has met monthly, where people share potlucks and crafts and learn Native songs and drumming and dance. And people from ANA have participated in many other gatherings and discussions and events in this area. So I want to recognize Reverend Nick Miles, who's in the audience, who is the convener of ANA. He was born born as part of the Pamunkey Nation of Virginia. And in the 1970s, he and his wife Linda lived in the New Paltz area, and they joined this Association of Native Americans. And Nick became part of the drum circle, where he learned songs and drumming of Native Americans. He also, around that time, became the pastor of the Reformed Church in Bloomington, here in Rosendale, where he served for 39 years until he retired. He continued through this time to be part of ANA, where he became the keeper of the drum and the lead singer. So I'm thrilled that he's part of our audience today, and he's done such a wonderful job leading ANA through these years. When I moved to the area over a decade ago, I found ANA, and I love the monthly gatherings. It's a community that feels like an extended family. In the warm months, we go to powwows and festivals in New York and surrounding states. When invited, we speak at schools and community gatherings. Of course, our gatherings have not happened in the last 9 months. They're suspended during the pandemic, but we will resume them as soon as we can. So that's just a brief introduction to ANA, and now Rob is going to talk about Old Dutch Church.
Old Dutch Church was founded in 1659 And one of the things that I get to steward at Old Dutch Church is not only its property and its building, but also its history. And so as we learn more about our history and we dig into our past, we come to a knowledge that the past has not always been wonderful, that there is times that we need to pause and look at our history and to offer confession. The Reformed Church is a Protestant denomination that comes over with the Dutch. It is the state church. It is the state religion. Partly the reason why the church was needed in Wildweg, the wild place, which was the previous name of Kingston, was that in order to have a seat in the government, you had to be a member of the Dutch Reformed Church. So that's a little bit of our shaded history of church and state being mixed together. And it kind of tells you, where we came from, who we are. And as we look to the past and we want to examine the past, maybe with a little more clarity, we then really it only leads us to a confessional stance. We have, as a congregation, also reached out and have done reconciling work with the African American community as well. That was one of the first things we worked on. And then later, it was evident at a time when we did not have a pastor that the consistory was meeting, and it was decided that we would like some diversity in the pulpit in the absence of a full-time called pastor. And that's how I became to know, how I became familiar with Nick Miles. I had knew him a little bit, but we were able to ask him to come in and preach in our pulpit. I was always really happy. It was really the year that Pastor Nick had retired from Bloomington and was able to say, would you come and preach for us at Christmas? And it was a really lovely thing. But we also had this deep kind of like, oh, there's something we need to do. We need to cultivate this Native relationship. And that sort of was this work. This is where the seeds of our recognizing that all of our past wasn't just terrific, and that those of us who have inherited this church also need to confess. The church is one of the oldest institutions. It is the oldest institution between New York City and Albany. This is an institution which has sustained its succession since 1659. So therefore, we also have a lot of the history. We're involved a lot of, in this time, we're involved in the displacement of Native people from this land. And this kind of is what brings up the desire to learn more about Native people, to support Native and Indigenous people's causes, not only in this area, but throughout the United States. And that's just a little bit of a history on where we come from. The rest of the history of the church is pretty well known to most people.
So the next part that we're going to each speak briefly on is how this reconciliation got started. And as I think the previous speaker, that is Heather, described, that was a very good introduction to why there are no tribes that are, have land here in mid-Hudson Valley, because they were removed. And she's speaking for a huge number of, people who were forced westward. And so some of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Federation tribes, all of them, the 6 tribes, they do have reservations across central New York, small reservations. They faced a lot of hardship, but they still maintain those reservations, and they're a real basis of their strengths today. And also there's another reservation, a state recognized by the state of New Jersey, of the Ramapo Lenape down right on the border of New York and New Jersey that also has land that is their reservation, also small, but it's been a basis of their heritage. Whereas here, basically everybody was removed. A lot of people tried to stay, and many did by kind of marrying into or disappearing into the white population or the Black population. But also many were displaced, and it was a tremendous toll on people's heritage and their culture, their way of life. So one of the ways that this reconciliation began for Native people around here was in 2013. There was a renewal campaign for a treaty called the Two-Row Wampum Treaty that was signed 400 years earlier with the Dutch people in the Albany area. It was basically between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee Federation, of which the Mohawks are part. And so they signed a treaty in the Albany area, and the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, and this is what the Haudenosaunee were offering in their treaty. It was an agreement of respect between Indigenous people and the Dutch. It was an agreement to share the river of life and to take care of Mother Earth. And this language, this understanding shows a real difference between the Native people in this area and the Europeans, because the Europeans were there to trade, they were there to make money, they were there to, as Heather mentioned, to eventually to clear cut the forests and sell that wood and make more money out of it. So the orientation of the Europeans and the Native people was very different. The Native people saw the forests as their home, and their orientation was to protect their home, and to travel down the river of life with respect of their traditions and respecting European traditions and religion, and to share this. That was their conception of this treaty. So 400 years later, the Haudenosaunee people in New York State initiated the Two-Row Wampum renewal campaign based on the same principles. What they wanted to do was to respect each other, for all of us to respect each other and to work together to protect our earth, which then was facing building pipelines for fracking and all that kind of stuff was going on in New York State, and still is to a certain extent, although fracking itself has been made illegal. So anyway, that was the Two-Row Wampum campaign, renewal campaign, was initiated by the Haudenosaunee, and after several years of preparations, hundreds of us, Native and allies and European and Native base, we paddled down the Hudson River, which is Mohican-Munsee, as Heather instructed us. That's the name of the river. And for 2 weeks, we paddled in canoes and kayaks and traveled on the water all the way from the Mohawk River to Albany, and then from Albany down all the way to New York City. And every night we camped on the riverside, and we held public gatherings, some small, some big. In Beacon, for example, we held a big day-long powwow attended by hundreds of people. And speaking for myself as a paddler and also as being part of preparing for this, the Two-Row Wampum renewal campaign was a profound sharing and learning experience. And so it was during the course of this Two-Row Wampum campaign that Paul Tobin, who's in the audience, he's been a teacher and a leader of ceremonies in this area for decades, really teaching Native, many things of Native. And he made pipes that he gave to people who were part of this reconciliation. And he offered one of these pipes, gave one of these pipes to the Old Dutch Church, and its picture is on the beautiful flyer that that's brought us together today. So that's a little about how this process began, and now Rob's going to tell us what happened then.
So on that, there was a specific day when we were given the condolence pipe by Paul. And then shortly thereafter, the leaders of Old Dutch Church committed to the process of reconciliation with First Nations people living in the Hudson Valley. Over the next 3 years, we met regularly with the Association of Native Americans in the Hudson Valley, which was basically our friends from Anna, sharing meals, telling the truth about the stories of our history, seeking reconciliation, and committing to serve the good of our communities and to protect the goodness of the earth. In the course of these conversations, our Native American brothers and sisters offered their forgiveness. In November 2016, at our shared Native American Thanksgiving celebration, we awakened and smoked the condolence pipe together. We would have loved to have done that again this year, and we had placed the pipe out on display, but it longs to be smoked again, and one day it will. And based on our truth and our truth-telling and reconciliation, the consistory then made a public statement of reconciliation.
Do you want to read that statement?
Yes, and I can read you how this statement goes. It says, on behalf of and with our Dutch ancestors, we, the consistory of Old Dutch Church, acknowledge that we failed to live up to the promises made to First Nations people in the Two-Row Wampum Treaty. We acknowledge, confess, and lament that we took life, took land, failed to live in equality, friendship, and peace, and failed to honor and respect the values, spirituality, and the way of life of our Native American neighbors. We misunderstood, dehumanized, and exploited these brothers and sisters who welcomed us to their homeland. Over time, we imposed our values, religion, language, culture, and way of life, making these the dominant and controlling forces in which we would live our common life. We are truly sorry for these actions, both intentional and unintentional, and we acknowledge and we apologize for the loss, suffering, and grief they brought upon our First Nations sisters and brothers. To those from the Association of Native Americans of the Hudson Valley and Niitap Kitap, we have shared this journey towards reconciliation and renewed commitment. We humbly express our deep gratitude for your willingness to eat, talk, teach, listen, sing, give thanks, and dance together. And for your gracious forgiveness, we commit ourselves to labor with you to fulfill the vision of the 1613 Two-Row Wampum Treaty, to live in a relationship of equality and respect that honors your wisdom, culture, spirituality, and way of life, and welfare of all people, all creatures, and our precious Mother Earth. For as long as the sun shines, as long as the water flows downhill, and as long as the grass grows green. And this was adopted by the consistory of the Old Dutch Church.
So that's a very powerful statement, and we really appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. We appreciate the openness, the conversation, and the broadening of our own lives together. I think this was such a wonderful thing. We have made not only reconciliation in this historical thing, but we have made deep friendships in the course of this, yeah, which is really beautiful.
That's true. I'm going to read the response by a representative of Anna, It's a reconciliation statement of Reverend Nick Miles, whose native name is Tecumseh Red Cloud, and he represents Anna in this statement. He says, when European settlers brought Christianity to this continent, they strongly communicated to the indigenous people that they needed to become believers. They must give up their culture and their identity. Historically, our government and its representatives have consistently broken treaties and trust with indigenous nations. Walls of anger, hurt, and mistrust resulted. Many Native people heard stories from relatives and friends of how their families and tribes were affected by policies of state and church, still felt to this day. Walls of communication, misinformation, and stereotypes must continue to be broken down and replaced with trust and acceptance to make way for the respect of and honoring of each other's culture. We must be willing to listen, to learn, something many failed to do in the past. It's a two-way street, for we both honor the creator of all that is and live in harmony with all of life. Reconciliation has been long overdue. We started the process in 2013 with the presentation of a condolence pipe. It was and still is time to reach out and to build relationships, to love our neighbors. Life among Native peoples is first of all relational. Relationships take time. There must be commitment to friendship for the long haul, which we will continue to honor. We will continue to move boldly forward, yet humbly, because we know the Creator's heart is for all nations and peoples of the world to coexist peacefully. And Nick Miles concluded with a presentation of gifts. He says, I have two canoes made by the clay of the Pamunkey River in Virginia. One I will place in our bundle containing various items of Anna's history. The other I present to you to be placed next to the condolence pipe to remind us of our traveling together in the river of life, living side by side on our Mother Earth with all that our Creator has blessed us with. And that's his statement. That's Anna's statement.
So the question comes to, what does this process mean? And Sally and I have spent several hours just exploring what it means. And I really want to say that I appreciate Jeff for inviting us on to talk about this subject. So many of you in the audience are historians, and you have a responsibility for keeping history, but you also have a responsibility, I think, to presenting it honestly. And I feel as a historian myself, we are often given stories, and we need to examine those stories and to explore them and to also open them up so that we can hear the full story. Because if we only have one-sided histories, then we don't really have a history at all. And so Sally and I discussed what was so important. You heard me sort of jump the gun on this and sort of say our friendship is important. What came out of the reconciliation is friendship. You see people out when you're shopping and you stop and have very long conversations because you miss them and you want to know about them and you want to catch up. So reconciliation definitely has to be between people. I think that's the primary thing. As historians, wherever you are and whatever your work is to expand your circle of friends. And that'll help you to be better historians. It'll help you tell the story of the place that we're living in. You'll accomplish your work better when we're together.
Okay, yes, I certainly agree with that. And one of the things that I think is really important is that reconciliation is not just one meeting. It's not even 10 meetings. It's an ongoing process. And if it ends, then it's a failure. I mean, in other words, it's an ongoing thing of relationships, of friendships, of working together. And so you really don't, I mean, there can be beginnings and ends of different aspects of it, but it's the most important thing is that it's an ongoing process. And I'm just going to mention a couple of things that we've done, and then I think we ought to open it up to questions. Besides have every year, we've had a Native American Thanksgiving or green corn ceremony at Old Dutch Church. So that's gone on for a number of years. And we're blessed with Nick Miles' beautiful voice and his beautiful speaking and doing, leading the service. So that's one thing that we have done every year, even this year, in socially distanced proper way, and Zoom. It was a combination. 2 years ago, we had an important conference that was honoring, it held at Old Dutch Church, that was honoring Native Americans lost in the Pavonia Massacre of 1643. That was a conference that was organized by Evan Pritchard, who's the author of Native Americans, who's mentioned by Heather or somebody else in this evening. And that was a really, really wonderful program. Last year, we had a program on the state of Maine and the Wabanaki Native Federation that had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on child welfare in Maine. And the church, Old Dutch Church, bought a copy of a documentary that was made of this Truth Commission called Dawnland. So the church has that. I assume still.
We do.
And it's a wonderful documentary of a different kind of truth process, very important. And so we held that and showed the movie and had discussion about it. So it's just, we've also had events to save Cooper Lake that were very well attended, and we ended up saving the lake. There's also an ongoing struggle now around the Onteora Lake and the Bluestone Forest that I think also is something that we could also talk about doing some program around. And so I just think that relationship is really important. And in this age of pandemics and of catastrophic storms and stuff, the whole thing of honoring Mother Earth, learning to live with Earth and not destroy Earth is why our ongoing relationship is even more important in the years to come.
Yes.
So.
I think that was one of the things that we were able to sort of come together on, the things that made us, the things that we cherish. And the earth is something that the church is very much into saving, right? It is care of creation. And it's something that we can find partners with and to be able to speak on and share a common interest in. And so that was also like paving the way forward. Oh, these things are environmental issues, and we have allies that we can call on and experts that we can join up with. And we can also build our relationship by caring for the community. And in so caring for the community is based on the care that we give to each other in our relationship. So the stronger our relationship is, the stronger that we are to be able to serve the community. So that's really important work for the church. So it's just a natural fit. And so just working for reconciliation where things flow together very beautifully is something that we would offer to historical organizations when you're trying to figure out, well, what story needs to be told and how can we do it? Well, if there are some intersections between different groups, those are the places where we would recommend that you strive to build the connection. Just little touching points are the way to build a strong bond.
And so I'm sure we're very happy to, if there are any questions, we,
There are.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
Do
are a few that go together, and I'll just ask them all, and then you can sort of work with them. There have been a number of questions about asking where they can get copies of the reconciliation statement, if there's a website, and if Anna has a website. And then following up with that, what happened after the reconciliation statement was brought together? And a sort of interesting one, were there members of the congregation or Anna who objected to the reconciliation? And how was the decision about the reconciliation, the process presented to the congregation and the community? So I'll throw those all out together and then we'll move on to another topic.
Sure. There was, as far as we know, there were no objections to Native American reconciliation. We're really pleased with that. But it was also like a process. So by the time you get through the process, if there were any hesitancy, those things get smoothed away because you've now formed a relationship. I think if we wrote a reconciliation statement years earlier, there would have been, but now that we know these people, and it's harder to object to them. So that's it. It's, again, it was relational. That's how reconciliation statements have to come, and it sort of comes up through the people. So it's not that the minister in the church does this work. They are part of that work, but it also comes before elders and deacons in the Reformed Church, and so we come to these agreements together. And I think that's true of Anna as well. Yeah,
it is. And the church is much more developed. We don't have a website. So that's something, I mean, I don't think we're going to form one. We don't, Anna has, and also Nitop Kitop doesn't have a treasury. We just don't, that's not the way we operate. But I think, I think it is something we can certainly make the statements available. And will figure out how to do that.
The statements should be available on the website of the Old Dutch Church at olddutchchurch.org. It's kind of a dense website and you have to get into it in order to find it, but I will also post these to Facebook in the morning. You can just go to Old Dutch Church on Facebook if that's the way to find them, and also contact the church. We'd be happy to share them. This is not something that we make in secret. This is something that when we publicly confess, like when you're part of a church and you make a public confession, you want it acknowledged. And so therefore, we want to acknowledge our confessions of wrongdoing. It's part of the way that we seek healing. It's part of by speaking truth. And it's part of the way that we heal other people when we speak those truths and recognize it. And then the next step is, after you've confessed, is that you want to live in the way that, right? You want to follow, you want to live in the good life. And so that's the continuational process that we continue. It's not just a once confession, it's a repeated reminder of that we have failed, and let's move on. Let's move forward with each other. So it's kind of this living thing. So reconciliation statements are not just pieces of paper that get filed away. They have to be lived out to really honestly, truly work. Yeah.
Okay, there are a few questions about Native Americans in the area, and I'll just ask them as a group again. What efforts are underway to help identify and protect Native American ceremonial stone landscapes in Ulster County, which may be threatened? Then there's a question about the threat. Well, this you addressed about the threat to Oneonta Lake. Two people asked the same question about information on cultural land easements for land in the foothills of the Catskill Mountain. And are there historic sites in the area that are being preserved? So
Okay, so sounds like I'm getting some homework assignments. I can't respond. I know people who are involved in the Ontiora Bluestone thing, and I know that there's some research going on as far as like archaeological importance. And I don't know about the Catskill, but I can, you know, we'll figure out a way to.
Yeah.
There is the man I mentioned before, Evan Pritchard, he does have a lot of historical knowledge about these things in this area. He's been researching this for a long time, and so I will consult him on answering some of these questions, and maybe we can include some of that on the Old Dutch website. Since we don't have a website, we could.
So yeah, and so being in the town historian, so I can speak on the behalf of what I know here in my own town. We have this beautiful Cockburg Ridge, which runs really from the Palisades. It runs all the way up through Albany, and it's really right outside of my door here. And the house is made of that. But unfortunately, most of the roads around here that we all drive on are also made from that ridge. And the cement industry, which really devastated the natural landscape here, is also coming out of that ridge. And so before that ridge actually gets developed, it's really crucial that we get proper archaeology done. And it's something that I advocate for, because that is the historical record of Indigenous people. Yeah. And it needs to be taken seriously, because once it's lost for good. And I think it's all of our responsibility to make sure that the archaeology gets done. It's not just old stone house foundations or, you know, little glimpses of a 400-year-old Dutch past. It's thousands upon thousands of years of archaeological remains that are all around us, that are being ground up and sold off every day. So I think it is responsibilities of town historians to be aware of when places are being developed, to inquire about the archaeology and what stages of archaeology is being done, because the area that we live in is rich. There was a site that we were involved with, and Anna was involved in as well. Members of Anna were involved to preserve that was located on the ridge, and it was a beautiful site of a workshop. So we all know the native projectile points and sort of what they would look like, but we didn't know much about really the manufacture. Well, just, you know, a half a mile away, there was a native workshop, a lithic workshop, where they had it all in production, and there were stones that were used as anvils that were flipped over top of the various stages of these projectile points. And, you know, we might think Henry Ford invented the assembly line. Here we have evidence that Native people were working in groups of assembly line, passing projectile points from one place to another as they would become finished. That's amazing. These were, we believe, they were West Sand Lake people. What we learned from that one site doubled what we had learned before. That site did get protected by an easement. The property around it was developed, but there was an easement over that most particular site. And I was also responsible to bring those artifacts back, because the developer did not pay the archaeologist. And normally you have to pay to have these things stored. They were up for grabs, and I advocated that those artifacts be brought back. I petitioned Nina Pasternak, the county clerk, and she received them into the Hall of Records, because I said, these were records. If you need to preserve the records of Ulster County, these are the records of Ulster County. And I was very delighted that she received them, and those finds and projectile points were on display at the Person House that following year. So yes, there's much more work to be done. Thank you for that question, and you know, and to all those town historians out there, when development comes, advocate for the archaeology, even if there isn't sort of Western remains there, because very often on the first phase of archaeological surveys, you will find that there are important archaeological things of the native people, and literally thousands of years old. So.
Somebody asked about Heather's contact information, and I'm putting it in the chat since she said that people could get in touch with her, so it's there. Somebody else wanted to just mention to the group that Historic Huguenot has been offering virtual classes in the Lenape language with Karen Moscow of the Munsee Delaware Nation. And if people are interested in that and having it offered again, they should email Kara at huguenotstreet.org. Somebody asked for Sally about mentioning the treaty rental we've had for the past 4 years between the Ramapo and the Ulster County government that took place on the Clearwater.
Okay, oh boy, I was there, but I wish, I think that's Paul Tobin. I wish he could speak on that.
Okay.
Is that,
I don't know. Karen, is it
that
possible
coming from
to unmute Paul Tobin?
Yeah, we'll do that.
Okay. Paul, we're putting you on the spot.
Okay. Yeah, well, we, I mean, that also came out of the Tura Wampum treaty. Before that, I had visited the Nichols Treaty Belt that's held by the Ulster County Clerk's Office and became friends with Nina. And then we decided to renew that treaty that hadn't been renewed in 300 and some odd years. And I believe the first one we renewed in High Falls, the second one in New Paltz, the third one back in High Falls, and then the fourth one on the Clearwater. And the Ramapo are descendants of the, not descendants, but are the same people as the Esopus. So we've been doing that every year. And the last one we did in High Falls, we put the names of some of the native signers on these 2 sticks that we presented. And Nina also has a pipe that we gifted her during the Tura Wampum renewal campaign. So I felt it was important to involve the, some of the principles again. So Vince Mann comes up, we did an 80-mile canoe trip up the Walk Hill River, and the last time we came down the Roundout Creek and ended in High Falls. So this all came out of the NETOP KETOP and our whole year of planning for the stop in Kingston. That was, very enriching for all of us. So I just wanted to mention that because Sally was on the boat there at the Clearwater. And so we'll be doing that again next year, renewing that treaty again. And Vince Mann, who is the Turtle Clan chief, made a comment that we were supposed to bring a stick each year. And he said, well, to make up for the couple of 100 years that we haven't come, it would overload my pickup truck, but we can't do it. But what it did was create, a good relationship between that. And I missed the Thanksgiving at the Old Dutch Church this year, but they have been so center in providing the elder brothers that Kogi came a couple of years ago. We were actually able to give them pipes that connected them to the Tura renewal campaign. And they usually don't accept gifts from people on the outside. And we did that right in the little kitchen there off the hall in the Old Dutch Church. So we have to thank them for, being definitely allies in this. And so the last thing I want to say is the condolence pipe is made from the wood of sumac, and it has a piece of a black walnut tree that is still growing in Ulster County. That's 400 years old. The sumac represents the condolence beads, and Hiawatha was condoled by the peacemaker. And in the condolence, they wipe away the tears, clear the ears, remove the grief from the throat, and open the hearts up. So those are the words of condolence, but it's also a renewal of relationships. Because when you fall out of relationships, it's like you have a death. And in order to get over that, if you don't clear the tears from your face, the salt will make you cry again. If you don't unblock your ears, you can't hear each other again. So the dialogue that was started between Nitop Kitop and Anna and the Old Dutch Church, that remove the tears, unblock the ears, remove the grief from the throat, and open their hearts up to each other. And with that, I'll be quiet.
Thank you.
Thank
One other question, I'm not sure who this is to go to, but about the effort to have Native American interpretive signs installed on the Ashokan Rail Trail. Anybody?
Sounds good.
We support that idea.
Okay, yeah, I don't, Glenn Kreisberg asked it. So does anybody know about?
One of the wonderful things, I think one of the wonderful things about just being in the Hudson Valley is that we experience Native language in various places. Like the Dutch accepted a lot of these names and places, and so we always have these funny words, and we're not really sure what they are, but we speak them all the time. And so there's still this history that we still have. And of course, what happened to Native people, the Indigenous people, then also happened to the Dutch, right? So we have these Dutch words thrown in too. And now that we've been colonized once again by the English, now, but we still have these little remnants to hold on to. And they're like little pieces of memory for us. And they're starting points. So it's always great to name places when we know Native names, to have those put on. So listen, it sounds like a project we would love to be able to support.
Okay, so somebody needs to take it on as a project. Okay, I think we.
I think that these are ideas that we could perhaps,
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, Jeff, I'm going to swing back to you. I think we've covered most of the topics that we can cover.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. This has been a beautiful evening for me. The more work I do in the community with the more different groups, I am really humbled by how many people are out there working and doing things to keep the different cultures alive, to keep them moving forward, to and also just really humbled at what we have to learn from one another. When we open up our hearts and we listen to people rather than shouting them down. And so I really thought when I read this document that it was, or both the documents, that it was a really wonderful point of inspiration for me. And it's part of my mission here to spread the word, that there are other ways to be, and that we have a lot to learn from one another. And personally speaking, even from reading the newspaper every day, I think we have a lot to learn from the Native people that will help us with climate change, because I don't think there is anyone else who is that close to nature, who is that close to understanding it, living in it, and having it flow through them than the Native Americans. And for me, anyway, that's the number one, threat to our future. So I really do thank everyone who participated this evening. both the people who gave the presentation and the people who came and have lasted till the end here. I really am grateful for it. So thank you one and all. It's been a wonderful night for me, and I hope for you too. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.